I'd like you to imagine for a moment that you're engaged to be married. You've spent the last several months with your betrothed getting everything ready. You found a home in the town where you wish to settle down and raise a family. You've secured a good job in the new location. You've been working through marriage prep and you've spent time praying and mentally preparing for the new adventure of married life. All that remains is to meet with the priest and plan the details of the wedding ceremony. Now imagine that your priest tells you that he intends to marry you in the parking lot of the parish center on a Friday afternoon at 5 p.m. after he gets off work. There's no need to dress up, he says, just come as you are. For canonical witnesses, he will drag out the parish secretary and custodian to witness the marriage. No guests, after all, they're not necessary. The whole thing can be wrapped up in 5 minutes. Then, to celebrate, there won't be a reception. Instead, he's going to give you a gift card for $10 off any entree at Chili's so you and your beloved can celebrate over a discounted Chipotle bowl. Now, I suspect in this situation that most of you would feel extremely indignant. You would feel like the life changing significance of what you and your partner were about to undertake would not be accurately reflected in this stripped down, slipshod, minimalist routine. You would feel that something was radically off, that such an important occasion should be marked with greater solemnity. And you'd probably feel annoyed that all of the effort and preparation and build up to the big day was not being recognized by something with greater formality and splendor. Now imagine you and your betrothed made your concerns known to the priest, and he responded, "Stop complaining. It's a valid marriage. That's all that matters, right? That's what you're here for, to get married. As long as you walk away married, we don't need any of that other fluff." Now, we all know that in a pinch, a couple could be married in the manner described, but administering the sacrament of matrimony in this way should be reserved for emergency situations like during a war or something. It should absolutely not be the normative means by which Catholics get married for all the reasons just mentioned. Under normal circumstances, we expect there to be ritual coherence. That is, the ritual actions we perform should appropriately mirror the significance we attribute to them. If we believe the ritual we are undertaking is of tremendous import, then the ritual actions that constitute the ceremony should reflect this. And now we can begin to understand the traditionalist critique of the Novus Ordo. And for the sake of this video, when I speak of the Novus Ordo, I am speaking of the NO as it is celebrated in the vast majority of Catholic parishes. I am not referring to the so called unicorn Novus Ordos, such as you'd see at Oxford Oratory or Assumption Grotto. There is something to be said for those kinds of masses, but they are statistically insignificant, as they do not reflect the experience of most Catholics worldwide. Now, the priest in our wedding example is technically correct in the facts of his argument. Such a reductionist wedding ceremony would be valid, but he would be drastically, horrifically wrong about the assumption that underlies such an argument, namely, that mere validity is all we should care about when administering a sacrament. As a traditionalist content creator who frequently criticizes the status quo in Catholic parishes around the world, it's beyond frustrating for me to see constructive, intelligent critiques of the Novus Ordo met with the rejoinder, but it's still valid. Christ is there. As if stressing the validity of the new Mass somehow negates every critique of it made over the last 50 plus years. Most traditionalists recognize that the Novus Ordo is a valid liturgy. Yes, I know there are a minority who don't, and I'm sure you will hear from them in the comments. But for most of us, the new Mass is regarded as valid, and yes, Jesus is there. But while we admit the equality of the Old and the New Mass as to the sacrament, we find the new Mass inferior as a liturgy. We grant that Jesus is present in the new Mass, but how then should his presence be recognized? How should it be solemnized? How should our rituals coherently express this reality? with greater or lesser solemnity. Now, I can predict that at this point, some will say, God is eternal. There's literally nothing that we humans can do that appropriately reflects his majesty. Even the most beautiful stained glass, the most elevated chant, the most solemn high liturgy, it's all like dust compared to his majesty. So all this talk about a liturgy that suits the divine presence is therefore absurd because nothing we can offer suits him. To which I respond, okay, so therefore we just don't even try. We just don't do anything. We just make zero effort. My home can never be fit for a king. So therefore, I won't even bother to be hospitable if the king comes to visit. That's ridiculous. We all understand that no human action can sufficiently reflect the majesty of God, at least considered absolutely when comparing creature to creator on an ontological level. But when we take into account God's condescension, the way God opens himself to humanity, interacts with us in ways suitable to our fleshly existence, then we begin to see that, yes, there are certain ways that are more fitting than others for us to acknowledge him within the economy of communication that God has opened up with man. We know, for example, that a jar of alabaster ointment is absolutely nothing when compared to the omnipotence of God. But that omnipotent God took on flesh and entered a world where that alabaster ointment did mean a great deal. Enough that when it was poured on his feet at Bethany, Christ willed that the memory of that pious action be perpetuated forever. Christ himself has ordained that the church honor God corporately through the sacred liturgy. And liturgy is not some vague, amorphous concept. It's a series of concrete, ritualized gestures with its own ecosystem of meaning, its own inner logic, honed by centuries of the church's prayer and experience, so that we can offer God as fitting a worship as possible within the economy of salvation. There's literally no higher way to praise Him. But we miss out on so much of this when we focus on mere validity. In earlier periods of church history, when theologians were still debating the form and matter of the sacraments, discussions about validity were an important part of working out what exactly a sacrament consisted of and under what conditions it could be conferred. But those debates have long since been settled. In modern times, discussion about validity was most important when discussing emergencies, like if a sacrament needs to be administered quickly in a crisis situation with zero time to spare. What is the bare minimum that is required to confer it effectively? And it's good to know this information. It's good to know the formula of baptism in case one of us ever needs to hastily baptize a dying person. But we are a long way from the times when discussion about validity were pressing matters in theology. But we're still getting bogged down in discussions about mere validity, and it shows how impoverished we are. We should be discussing how we can use the knowledge and resources we have to offer the most fitting liturgies. But I guess, like St. Paul says, we should have moved on to meat, but we're still babes that need milk. Mere validity should not be the normative principle around which we structure our worship. How pitiable we are if we are focusing on the bare minimum. If you were riding a bus up the side of a steep mountain and your driver kept swerving dangerously close to the edge because he said he wanted to see how near he could get to the cliffside without driving off of it, would you believe that your driver was serious about safety? Would you believe someone was serious about holiness if they asked, "What's the bare minimum I can do and still eke my way into heaven?" Would you not think his mindset was completely backwards? Why then would we adopt this thinking for our liturgy? One further point to consider: the sacraments give grace in two ways, according to the sacrament itself and according to the disposition of the receiver. The former is objective, but the latter can vary in degree depending on our preparation. If we know that the traditional gestures, prayers, and structures of the traditional liturgy create an atmosphere of reverence, it follows that they are better equipped to dispose our soul to encounter Christ in the liturgy, and therefore to reap a greater abundance of grace than if these things were lacking. Now, this isn't something I can prove, of course, but I think the anecdotal observations of thousands of Catholics who describe greater feelings of piety and reverence after discovering the Old Mass are a strong argument in its favor. Now, just like there's situations where someone will need to baptize in an emergency, so there will be cases when Mass needs to be offered in a more stripped down manner. I'm thinking of the famous World War II photograph, I think it's from D Day, where there's a priest offering Mass on the hood of a Jeep. That's an obvious exception, a situation where Mass will need to be offered in a more stripped down manner. But when we take exceptions and make them into norms, we thereby destroy all norms. And that is what is so objectionable about the way the new Mass is celebrated throughout most of the Catholic world. The norms of liturgical worship developed over centuries, reflecting the Church's highest vision for how God is to be honored, are simply jettisoned. The sacrament might still be valid, but as a liturgy, the new Mass has been disastrous. And it's very important to remember that the sacrament and the liturgy are two different things. The Eucharist takes place within the liturgy, but is not itself the liturgy. The liturgy is a structural framework that is meant to both defend and celebrate the majesty of the sacrament. And the liturgy and the sacrament are mutually reinforcing. The liturgy helps us receive the Eucharist worthily, and Christ's presence in the Eucharist imbues the Mass with a transcendent value. It's a two-way street. It is angels ascending and descending on Jacob's ladder. To simply say, the Mass is the Mass, it's valid, and I don't care about the rest, is to rip the integrity of the liturgy apart by focusing on only its most reductive aspects and negating the entire supporting structure that has spoken so excellently to the faithful over the millennia. So please, stop thinking of our worship in such reductive terms. How about instead of making you 3 meals a day, I just give you a single protein pill with 2,000 calories and tell you, you're not going to eat meals from now on. Meals aren't necessary. This 2,000 calorie pill contains all the nutrients you need to stay alive. Is that true? Yes. Is it inhuman? Even more so. So stop this ridiculous cope, because that's all it is, one monumental cope to justify the bait and switch, to come to terms with the nefarious reality of the exchange. A green field for a cold steel rail, heroes for ghosts, hot ashes for trees, hot air for a cool breeze.